Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm proud of all of you for braving the traffic jams and lack of mass transit in this town all of a sudden. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and we are delighted to host the Chicago Council for yet another release of their American Public Opinion Survey on Foreign Policy. This is our third collaboration, and there will be many more. I have the highest regard for the Chicago Council and for the Honorable Ambassador, His Excellency Ivo Daalder. I also have to comment on my great affection for the Crown family, Lester and Renee Crown, and their children who have been such mainstays of the Chicago Council, and to say that while in Chicago just a week ago, I had a long and lovely meeting with Lester and Renee, who are both going strong, contributing mightily, as they have for decades, to the life of Chicago and Aspen. It's crucially important that in this so-called post-factual election that we push back. That is why a careful survey like this means so much and merits world attention, not just U.S. attention. That's also why we love co-hosting this event on Wilson's stage, even if it requires me, that would be me, taking a packed red eye from Denver last night. Oof. Are we sorry for me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. If you learn one thing from this survey, it's that Americans still want to be engaged in the world. That is a relief, and as far as I'm concerned, the right position. Seeing the world, as this survey does to some extent through the prism of Trump over the last year, seems to, for some, have skewed the fact that Americans want to be engaged in the world. But I know we'll discuss this. And even for those who say they may support Trump, a huge number of those want to be engaged in the world, and that's a great relief. So I think a better way to think about the election, and I know we're going to talk about this, is not that one of the candidates has the right view of the world, but that he and Bernie Sanders have pinpointed anger, and I don't think that's a bad thing, anger that existed, that both political parties failed to pay enough attention to. And that anger has to do with globalization, but it also has to do with the impact of automation and this new thing called AI, artificial intelligence. And we are going to have to rethink work in this country. And that's a project for the Wilson Center, the Chicago Council, and others to begin to make some progress on. So just a word about the Honorable Mr. Ambassador, His Excellency Ivo Daalder, who was our former ambassador to NATO. He knows probably, and is a European himself, he knows perhaps better than the rest of us do, that this anger is not just in the US, but it's certainly all over Europe, and it's being reflected in European elections and obviously the Brexit vote. Before his NATO tour, Ivo was the director for European Affairs on the NSC. He's a prolific author, and my thanks also to good friend Jackson Deal, deputy editorial page writer at the Washington Post, for moderating. Jackson is a foreign affairs junkie, having spent time in the Post's Buenos Aires, Warsaw, and Jerusalem bureaus, and he won awards for his coverage of the '89 revolution in Eastern Europe. He doesn't pull his punches, so what you get is refreshing. But first, let me turn to Dina Smeltz, a former State Department eye in our hand and an expert in conducting surveys like the one you will hear about today. Dina will present the survey, and then the rest of us will talk about it. Please welcome Dina.
Thank you, Jane, for shuttling back for this today. Thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting us again. And thank you also to Scott Clement and Emily Guskin from the Washington Post. The Washington Post partnered with us on the release of these survey results, and they've just been fantastic to work with. Usually my task at these events is to answer whether foreign policy, why does public opinion on foreign policy even matter? But this year my task is a little bit easier because clearly foreign policy does matter in these elections. Not only because Americans express increasing concerns after the attacks in Orlando and San Bernardino and in Europe over the past year, and not only because of the outcome of the Brexit vote, which shows that public opinion can still manage
to show this, right?
to surprise, but also because for the first time in decades, one of the candidates running for president is challenging the past 70 years of traditional U.S. foreign policy, one that is built on alliances, on open trade, and international cooperation. So quickly, just the full methodology of the survey is on page 37 of the report. And, but just quickly, it was conducted among 2,000 people from June 10th to the 27th. If you have other questions, you can look at the back or we can answer later. And really, these are the key takeaways in trying to understand this political moment. Donald Trump has harnessed the energy of a segment of the US public that is discontent with immigration particularly, and also trade. This discontent has been brewing for quite some time, though. It is not new, and in the near term, these concerns will persist regardless of which candidate wins. So let's just jump right into it. When I will be talking about core Trump supporters in the presentation, and it's also discussed in the report. What that refers to is we asked respondents who their top choice for president was among various primary candidates, and people were also able to write in another respondent if another candidate if that candidate wasn't listed. And as Jane said, both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders position themselves as outsiders to the establishment, and they gained quite a bit of traction among the electorate, not only from their own party, but 15% of independents said that Donald Trump was their top choice, and 27% of independents said the same for Bernie Sanders. So when we looked at the Sanders supporters versus Hillary Clinton supporters, we were really surprised that we didn't really see any significant differences between the two, even on climate change and trade, where we really expected to see these differences. But the opinions of Donald Trump's core supporters, especially on immigration and to a lesser extent on trade, set them apart from people who supported a different Republican candidate and from the American public at large. And so that's why we really focused in on them. If you look at this chart, every year we ask Americans to rate a series of potential threats, whether it would be a critical threat, an important but not critical threat, or not an important threat. And so just to give you some direction in reading this chart, on the far left, accordingly, are the Democrats, and in blue. In the middle are independents, in yellow. The red elephant is a Republican, and on the far right are orange core Trump supporters. And you can see that for supporters of Donald Trump, the possibility of large numbers of immigrant and refugees entering the United States is tied with international terrorism as the most critical threat, and followed very closely behind by Islamic fundamentalism at 76%. So those are all in the same ballpark. About 80% think those are all critical threats. For Republicans overall, immigration is the third most critical threat. And immigration doesn't register as a top threat among independents or Democrats. And again, for a full listing of all the top 5 threats, you can see page 14. So again, looking at immigrants, the Trump supporters, as you saw on the previous slide, they seem to blend fears of terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, and immigration together. And as a result, their views of Middle Eastern immigrants in the United States, only 15% of core Trump supporters have a favorable view, compared to 29% among Republicans, half among independents, and a majority among Democrats. Overall, 40% have a favorable view, and 15% of core Trump supporters have a favorable view. Also, Mexican immigrants, Trump supporters are a little more favorable at 33% favorable, compared to almost half of Republicans and majorities among the rest of the public. We also talk about immigration reform in the report. For simplicity's sake, I just want you to focus on the last 4 bars. The orange bar on the bottom is the core Trump supporters, and 63% of core Trump supporters say that unauthorized immigrants living and working in the United States should be required to leave their jobs and leave the United States, compared to just 4 in 10 Republicans, fewer among independents and Democrats. And it's really striking. If you look overall, 28% support deportation, 63% of core Trump supporters support it. Not surprisingly, Trump supporters also are most in favor of building the wall, expanding the wall with Mexico, as are Republicans, but independents and Democrats tend to oppose it. So now moving on to globalization, because I said that is another factor in support, but to a lesser extent than on immigration. We asked people whether globalization is mostly good or bad for the United States, and half of Trump supporters, compared to majorities of everybody else, say it is good. And Trump supporters are the least likely to say that international trade is good for consumers like you, your own standard of living, and the US economy. They're also the least likely to support the TPP, but surprisingly, 49% of Trump supporters do support the TPP. So that goes against some of the things that he has been saying. So while Trump supporters are the most starkly opposed to immigration and globalization, these sentiments are not new. These issues had potency long before Donald Trump entered the race. Our long-term trends show that Americans have become increasingly divided by party over both immigration and trade. So if you look at this slide, again, they are by color: red, Republican; yellow, independents; blue, Democrats. You see that beginning in 2002, Democrats' concerns about immigration steadily decreased from 62% in 2002 all the way down to 27% in 2016. Republicans, on the other hand, are now more likely than at any other time to say that immigrants and refugees are a critical threat. They've pretty much stayed the same, but a little bit uptick to 67% this year. And the difference between Republicans and Democrats on this measure now stands at 40 percentage points, which is a historic high for Chicago Council surveys. And while the Republican Party has traditionally been the party to promote free trade as an engine of growth, economic growth, Republicans are now less positive than Democrats toward both globalization and international trade. 74% of Democrats say that globalization is mostly good versus 59% of Republicans. Still a majority, but not as high as Democrats. And while this isn't as yawning a gap as on immigration, the difference between Republican and Democratic views on globalization has grown steadily from 4% in 2006 to 15 percentage points in 2016. So on the broader issues of international engagement covered in our last chapter of the report, Americans are more like-minded. The report shows that in contrast to some of Donald Trump's positions, the American public as a whole still favors traditional alliances like NATO, maintaining bases overseas, including in our allies South Korea and Japan, and an active leadership role for the United States internationally. So to summarize the full synthesis of the findings, these results show that there are some glaring partisan differences on immigration and trade, and possibly because both issues have a domestic as well as an international component, so it might make it closer to home for respondents. Donald Trump's hardline position on immigration and criticisms of trade have resonated with his base supporters who express more intense objections to these issues. But these views are not new. Democrats and Republicans have expressed differing opinions about immigration since 2002 and about trade and globalization since 2008. It's important to keep in mind that core Trump supporters' views are attractive to only a minority of the overall American public. Sometimes it's hard to remember that with all the noise coming out of the campaigns and the media coverage of campaigns. So finally, a majority of the U.S. public does support continued immigration to the United States and favors a pathway to citizenship. Americans overall think globalization is mostly good and support international trade. While the objections from Trump's camp on immigration and trade may persist for some time to come, eventually the demographic transition happening in the United States will play a factor in these debates. Those groups that are growing most quickly in the United States, non-whites, younger Americans, and the college-educated, support an open orientation to trade, toward immigrants, and to the world. And with that, I think we can start to discuss.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Jackson Deal of the Washington Post, and I'm very glad to be the moderator here today at this discussion. We've got a very interesting set of data to talk about with really some surprising findings. And we've got an excellent panel to discuss it. You've just heard Dina Smeltz, who is the Senior Fellow of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy on the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. We have, of course, Jane Harman, the Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center and a former Congresswoman from California. Ivo Daalder, who's the President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and a former U.S. Ambassador to NATO during the first part of the Obama administration. And Corey Sheikh, who is Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and was a senior National Security Council and State Department official during the Bush administration. So I'd like to just dive right in here. And Dina, if I could just follow up on some of the data you were talking about. I was really struck by the fact that if you look at core Trump supporters, 80% of them agree with him on immigration, but they disagree with him, at least by a plurality, on almost every other foreign policy issue that you poll. They disagree with him strongly on NATO. They disagree with him strongly on whether or not U.S. foreign bases are a good idea. 49% of them say globalization is a good thing, and a plurality of them support the TPP treaty. So how are we to understand this? Does this mean that Trump's core support is really all about resistance to immigration and perhaps racial feelings, or are these other issues helping him in some way?
I think one of the key takeaways from the study, especially our longitudinal analysis, is that these views have been present among Republicans for quite some time, and that Trump supporters are in some ways just turbocharged Republicans that they feel even more intensely along that way. You saw that since 2008, Republicans' views, critiques of trade and globalization have grown. Yes, they still tend to be positive, but they have grown more negative than they used to be. And on immigration, the same thing. They have pretty much stayed at 2/3 saying immigration is a threat, with a little bit of an uptick recently. So I see it as a part of the continuum of that front-leading edge of the Republican Party, or the partisans that have these objections.
Jane, if I can draw on your political expertise, I mean, given what this survey shows about what Americans think and even what Trump's own core supporters think, is he going to have the political capital to carry out some of the things he's been talking about if he gets elected, such as revolutionizing NATO or doing something, withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea?
Well, let me make a couple of initial points. First of all, I'm a recovering politician. Mm-hmm. It is not a 12-step program, but I'm very happy to be here in this beautiful, nonpartisan space. I come from Los Angeles, which is a majority-minority city. It already is that. California will be a majority-minority state in a decade or so. I don't remember what the exact number is, and our whole country is going in that direction. So for sure, views are going to evolve on issues like immigration. What will Trump be able to do if he gets elected? 5 weeks is a long time. We still have a lot of this movie to watch. I think you have to think about Congress when you think about what will Trump be able to do. Surely he'll be able to do some things by executive order. You know, he says he's going to tear up the Iran deal. That'll be interesting to see if he can do that. Some of the things he's proposing are clearly not legal. But to the extent he has to go to Congress to do things, I actually think, given the fact that the business model of Congress doesn't work, he might be able to do more than you think. Hate to say this, I'm scaring myself. But the way Congress works is there is an outside influence of just special interest groups, and they work on both political parties. The primary system we now have in most states, but not in California. In California, we actually have citizen commissions drawing the lines for Congress, and then we have a so-called jungle primary where everyone runs together. But in most states, they don't have that. And the primary system in both parties applies a litmus test to the candidates. And those who are bipartisan, that would have been me, and so forth, usually get primaried by somebody who is more to the left or the right of their parties. And they insist on certain kinds of fealty in order to vote for a candidate. And so that's the outside influence of certain groups, like organized labor, which has achieved a lot of positive things, but I think is wrong on trade. So this pushes people to take positions if they want to get elected, which people in Congress must want or they wouldn't be there, to take positions that are off-center. So I think that Trump could, at least on trade, get some real traction in Congress. I think the immigration issue is harder because of both the rise of Latinos and other immigrants as voting blocs and the change in the whole population in the country. But I think he could get somewhere there. On NATO, I don't think he'll get anywhere. I just don't think, based on anything I know, that there's enough sophistication about NATO or that would be the kind of hot-button issue that he would be able to succeed on.
Ivo, if we can talk about NATO, I mean, it's kind of an interesting number here, 60% of Americans supporting U.S. engagement in NATO, which strikes me as probably a higher figure than in most other NATO members. I wonder if you could put that number in a little bit of context for us, first of all, and then look at a second question, because you wouldn't know that the support was that given the rhetoric we've heard in the campaign. And I'm wondering, to what extent has the damage already been done to NATO by the kind of debate we've had about it in this campaign?
Well, obviously these figures represent a brilliant stewardship at NATO by certain ambassadors.
Like who?
But I mean, the numbers are quite surprising. Even among Trump supporters, so the core Trump supporters, 60% think that the United States should either maintain or increase its commitment to NATO. It's 75% for Americans overall. That's a remarkable number. The number's a little lower, but not that much lower. It's still a large majority when it is NATO essential to American security. So it's gratifying to see that in this, and in fact in so many other aspects of the poll, you find an American public that remains dedicated to the kind of open, engaged foreign policy and global engagement that we, in many ways, have taken for granted for a very long time, and has been the basis, until very recently, of a bipartisan political consensus in this country. So I think on the question of whether, and I agree with Jane, the question of whether a Trump administration could fundamentally change our commitments. I mean, this is a treaty commitment, and therefore withdrawing from a treaty would take certain actions which they can do executively, so he could if he wanted to, but is less likely given the political support. That said, there is no doubt that the kind of debate we're having here in this country over the past few months has had a big impact in both Europe and Asia about not just whether Trump wins, but about what is it in America that allows a major political candidate to start questioning some of the most fundamental tenets of American foreign policy, of which our alliance commitments is probably the most fundamental of all, and our commitment to nuclear nonproliferation through alliances. Forgotten in the debate often is the reality that we have NATO and we have bilateral agreements with Japan and South Korea in order, in part, to say we will take care of your security so you don't have to acquire nuclear weapons, because we don't think that's a good idea. That's what we've said explicitly to the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Germans and others. And to have now a debate where those fundamental tenets are being called into question if you're sitting in Brussels or in Tokyo or in Paris or in London, you're going to say, what's going on in this country? That this is possible, that this is seen as a political winner. Our poll shows it's not. But the fact that somebody is making having those conversations is telling. And I think the challenge is, the damage to some extent has already been done. And the challenge for whoever gets elected to reassure our allies about the fundamental commitment that we have is going to be significant.
Mm-hmm. Corey, if I can turn to you, I mean, it seemed like maybe the most interesting finding in this poll was about trade and about TPP, that not only do a majority of Americans support it, but a plurality of Trump core supporters support it, and a plurality of Bernie Sanders supporters support TPP. So it makes you wonder why they were out there campaigning so hard against it. But Jane has sort of explained that to us a little bit and says that he could have some traction on trade. And so my question to you is, what if TPP doesn't happen? What if TTIP, our trade agreement we're trying to negotiate with the Europeans, doesn't happen because of these kinds of politics? What's that going to do to the foreign policy of the next president, whoever it may be?
It'll be a terrible setback for American interests if the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership doesn't pass. And I agree with you. It's one of the things that I found most interesting in the numbers. 56% of Bernie Sanders supporters support the TPP. The vast majority of Clinton supporters support it. And you would never know that from listening to the campaign rhetoric. Here's my prediction. If Hillary Clinton gets elected, she will come up with some magical unilateral adjustment on the part of Congress, claim that it's a completely new deal, and get enough Democratic support to partner with Republicans and pass the TPP. Because what I believe she must understand, having been Secretary of State, is that this enormous agreement is not only economically hugely valuable for its protection of intellectual property rights, which are such a major part of American exports, for reducing the kind of behind-the-border trade protection that many countries we export to have, and reducing trade barriers and bringing other manufacturers up to the labor standards and other standards that the United States operates on. But it is the essential statement about America's commitment to working with allies in Asia to set positive standards and to set norms by which we want all the Asian powers, by which I mean to say China, to participate on the basis of. And if we, having been the driver of this agreement, and so many of our Asian allies having been willing to make the difficult economic and political choices to bring it about, if we write it off, I can't imagine why any of those countries would enter into other kinds of agreements with us, security, political, or economic.
Jackson, could I just make one quick comment on the trade thing? The one qualification is that the poll shows that Americans are more negative about trade's impact on jobs and job security, and also other polls have shown on depressing wages. And so any message that comes at trade on one of those issues or one of those arguments does have traction among the public too.
I would just add a couple things. First of all, polls show that I think it's 85 or 90% of Americans think that people on the terror watch list should not buy guns, and yet that can't get through Congress. John Kerry was here for about an hour last week in between trying to stop the killing in Syria and trying to stop the killing in Syria, talking about trade and impassioned about this. And again, he's in that incredibly shrinking group of former members, I'm in it too, who were pro-trade, Democrats and Republicans. Both parties are shrinking. Mitch McConnell has said he's not going to bring the bill up during the lame duck session, TPP. That's what he said. I don't know if that's true, or let's see what happens in the election and who the president is. But if you're a member of Congress now trying to run for re-election, you're getting slammed by interests on both sides, in whatever party you're in, that are anti-trade. No one has made the case effectively. This would just, in case anyone's out there and wants to change this and align what's going to happen with what public sentiment is, you got to make the retail case. People have to be in the districts of members bringing in 100 workers from business A saying these jobs are going away if we don't have TPP or we don't have TIP, which isn't finally negotiated yet, but TPP is. They're going away. They're not going to come back. And this city place gains from trade. But the retail case hasn't been made effectively, and the Chamber of Commerce isn't that engaged, and others who are pro-trade aren't that engaged. And this is going to slide south very quickly, and I think it's going to be hard. I would hope Hillary Clinton would be for some tweaks to TPP and then having it pass. But I think that will be a hard political lift for her, too, if she's elected.
Ivo, can I ask you to talk a little bit about TTIP, which is the trade agreement with Europe? It seems like it has the advantage compared to TPP of having flown a little bit under the radar in this campaign. No one's really talked about it. Hillary hasn't had to go on the record saying she's against it. Given what we see in the public opinion in terms of attitudes towards trade, is this something that do you think could get some traction after the election, and could it be a way of rebuilding some confidence with the Europeans?
The biggest problem that TTIP has actually isn't here, it's in Europe.
Yeah.
And the Europeans, and particularly the most pro-trade of the Europeans, the Germans, are having a problem with this. Again, completely unrelated to the terms of the deal, having much more to do about the relationship with the United States. And the difficulties that Europe now has, which are all inward focused and very little outward focused. But that's where the problem is. Clearly from the United States perspective, pushing TTIP and a stronger trading and investment relationship with Europe should be a central component of our foreign policy with regard to Europe, and trying to find a way to reassure the European publics, who seem to be increasingly worried about getting together even within the European Union, let alone with the United States on issues of trade and investment, ought to stand front and center. How TPP plays out will have a major impact on our ability to do that. If we can't get TPP passed, why bother even, if you're a European, negotiating an agreement that's very hard to do domestically, when the likelihood is that TTIP won't be passed either. So that's why these things are interrelated, and why a political campaign that draws on sort of the latent existence of pro-trade sentiment, but then does it in a retail way is so important for the next administration. And frankly, to confront folks on the Hill, and this is Jane's bailiwick more than, but look at these numbers. Who are the most pro-trade Americans? They're Democrats by these numbers. 75% of Democrats think that globalization is a good thing for the United States. That's a pretty strong number. You wouldn't know that if you talk to any congressman or senator from the Democratic Party. Maybe one or two dinosaurs are still there, but there are not many of them. Dinosaurs from a bipartisan viewpoint, as opposed to age. I certainly don't want to. There are many young people who want to be in that.
But listen, Ivo, Trade Promotion Authority, which is the process by which Congress votes up and down on trade agreements, was approved in 2002 with the votes of 25 Democrats out of about 200 at the time. 25. Mm-hmm. And when it came up for approval again in 2015, that number rose by a whopping 3 to 28 Democrats out of 187. So there ain't a lot of support. This isn't even the vote for TPP. This is the process out there for trade in the Democratic Party.
I think part of the reason that trade is such a difficult issue is because the intensity of voter preference matters so much, right? A lot of the people who are pro-trade are softly pro-trade, and even the numbers in the Chicago Council study are over 40% of Trump supporters favor TPP. A plurality of Trump supporters believe that trade has been good for people like them. But what they are concerned about, as Dina said, is jobs and they believe that it will make future employment opportunities even less likely. And so the intensity of preference means that even though a majority of Americans, the people who care most and who are pressing on their members of Congress about this, are anti-trade, not
Just
pro-trade.
one other quick thing. Trade adjustment assistance has been our approach to helping workers impacted by trade. Most people think it doesn't work well or doesn't work at all. And so there are some new ideas out there, including an idea with some private sector companies, I think it's 51 of them, have banded together to figure out ways to retrain workers and find new work for those dislocated by the effects of trade. If Congress could figure out a new TAA approach, this could make a big difference as part of a package, a tweaked package for TPP.
I agree. I think that's really important.
I'd like to turn the subject to terrorism, because one of the other interesting findings of this was that all across the spectrum, huge majority agrees the biggest threat to the United States is terrorism. And so I'd like to ask each of you to think a little bit about what might happen with the next president and policy towards terrorism. Given all the polarization we've had, will there really be some kind of significant change in the way the United States fights the Islamic State if either Trump or Clinton get elected? Or are we more likely actually to just see a kind of continuity of what the Obama administration is doing with maybe slightly different rhetoric? Jane, maybe you start.
I don't think we will see a continuity. I don't mean that Obama will be repudiated by Hillary Clinton should she win. He might be repudiated by Donald Trump if he wins. But I think we have not had a strong narrative about what we stand for and what we're trying to do. We've had a lot of tactical responses, not a strategic response. And I think Hillary Clinton has pledged to provide a more articulated strategy. And I think we need it in two dimensions. First of all, he, using the bully pulpit of the presidency, has to explain it to the world. And I think Obama tried early in his presidency in Cairo and didn't get very far and kind of dropped that. But I think she or he will do that. But I also think in terms of stopping terror recruiting in this country, that's the biggest threat to us, is homegrown, radicalized people who can cause a lot of damage because of the easy accessibility to guns, and it apparently isn't that hard to make pressure cooker bombs and things of that nature. We have to have messages that they see when they go online, and that is actually happening more. The tech industry is helping with that. But that message and our public message has to be congruent about what we stand for and what we're doing. And right now, I think it's very easy to distort, to use the vacuum that we have and distort messages and radicalize more people than should be radicalized.
Yeah, I think that's both true and likely to happen. That there's particularly in the cyberspace, needs to become a larger domain in both our public and certainly in our intelligence and private efforts in order to deal with recruitment. The ISIS is quite sophisticated in this, and it's working both here and in Europe. Whether you ask me, is there going to be really fundamental change that we will actually see and feel? I don't think so. I don't think there is a large community of people who believe that we need to significantly intensify the military effort to deal with ISIS, because that would mean going in on the ground. I don't see there both public or even elite support for that. The one area where I think we can do a lot more, and it would benefit us in a whole bunch of areas, is to do a much better job on creating an intelligence coalition that includes our European allies.
Yes.
The Europeans are way behind on the question of what intelligence they have, how they share it, what they do with it, and they face a problem that is at least as larger in many ways than we do with regard to homegrown and returning terrorists. We should be able to create a much better coalition of intelligence, both analysis and sharing, that allows us to get into these networks at a lot earlier stage And it is that terrorism really that is undermining the European Union, the European project. It's what's driving fears about immigration and migration and refugees. It's what driving borders to be increasingly closed as a means to respond to that. I think without the terrorist threat, Brexit would have been a different argument because immigration would have been a different argument. And we therefore have a real need to address this in that way. Again, you won't see a lot of it because a lot of this tends to happen at a very quiet, in a very quiet way. But the fact that you don't see it in this case means it's not actually happening. It should be happening because it's a major requirement for, I think, our security and the European security.
Corey, you're one of the senior Republicans who's on record as saying you won't serve in a Trump administration, but do you think that if he is elected, there will be some kind of discontinuity on this particular issue of fighting ISIS, or do you see him just sort of picking up what the plan the generals already have on the table?
Well, he has said a couple of contradictory things, right? The first is that he has a plan, but he's not revealing it because that would aid the enemy. And the second thing he said was that the generals, the ones that he doesn't fire, will have 30 days to give him a comprehensive plan to do this. I think, in truth, he's firing without aiming. But I think what is likely to happen in a Trump administration is very little change from the present course for a couple of reasons. First, I think if Donald Trump is elected, that he will very quickly get bogged down in trying to make executive actions that Congress and the courts, that are contested in Congress and the courts. And so the system will bog down, which will mean the status quo will govern in the meantime. The second thing is that so Jim Mattis and I run a project on civil-military relations at Stanford, and we did a series of surveys of public attitudes. And one of the things that came most strongly out of that was how little the public understands most of these issues because, as Jane said, the political leadership hasn't invested in education. And so what you see on issues like terrorism is wide volatility in public action, in public attitudes. So after a terrorist attack, the public will want something done. And I think that's a major impetus for Trump's policy statements, right? People want something done. But because political elites haven't invested in educating the public about the need for sustained long-term policies of the kind that Jane and Ivo were talking about, that there's actually very shallow support for the kinds of things that we need to do consistently over a long period of time to make sure we have the kind of information and the kind of cooperation that fighting terrorism actually requires. So I agree with Jane. It would be a fantastic thing if the next president spent a lot more time than the current president did in educating the public. The one other place where I think this is going to be problematic, and both Jane and Ivo mentioned it, is that in Silicon Valley, the tech companies, and in Europe, the governments and the public are very leery about America's terrorism strategies. And this too goes to the part of public education, right? That Europeans and Americans found out about a lot of these policies by leaks in the newspapers, not because the political leadership, and especially the president, made a public case for what needed to be doing, what we were doing, and why it needed to be done. And so the narrative gets driven by the opponents to it. And there is going to be an enormous amount of work for the next president to do to rebuild confidence in American tech companies and in European publics and governments for the kinds of policies that we think need to be in place to fight terrorism. And I would just suggest Donald Trump is not ideally suited to rebuild that kind of trust.
We're going to open it up to questions from the audience in a few minutes, but I do want to ask one other topic because though I didn't see it in the report, I think if we're going to have a discussion about foreign policy in this election, we do have to talk about Russia. for a couple of reasons. A, this is a campaign where we seem to have a fairly big difference between the two candidates in attitudes towards the current Russian regime. And secondly, because we have a lot of evidence being reported that Russia is actively trying to interfere in this election in some way or another. So I'd like to ask for that. And Dina, if I could just ask you, do you have any sense of where Americans are on the Putin regime and whether the degree that there might be support for the kind of sentiments you're hearing from Donald Trump that he's a great leader and we should work with him?
Yeah, we haven't asked, we just asked opinion of Russia, which is pretty unfavorable, but we did a study right after Putin invaded Crimea, and at that point, American public opinion of Russia was at Cold War lows. So it had already sunk at that point, and so I wouldn't expect it to improve from there. But that's about all we have in terms of public opinion at this point.
May I jump in on that? Because I think one of the really important things to come out of this report is how wide the consensus is among the American public for traditional American foreign policy, for engagement with the world, for close cooperation with our allies, for a leadership role that shares responsibilities with others but does lead, for one that protects our friends around the world and assists in shaping international institutions and accepts international norms and international agreements as crucial elements of how we shape the world. Vladimir Putin's Russia is so starkly in contrast to all of those things that I think what I took away from this report is that there's very broad American support for the kinds of policies that would better protect us and better protect our friends and better protect victims of Vladimir Putin's aggression.
And at this point, Americans don't really see what Russia is doing as a threat to American interests, but if there were some proven meddling in our elections, that could perhaps change.
Ivo, relations are at a kind of a low between the United States and Russia now. So what is the sensible way forward for the next president?
Well, I think we have gone through an interesting historical period where for 25 years the United States and all of its allies in Europe and Asia based policy towards Russia on the presumption that the Russians wanted to integrate into the West. The terms of that integration were to be negotiated. But in fundamental ways, there was the presumption that they wanted to trade with us and therefore they needed to be in the WTO. They wanted to have an international system of rules and laws, whether that's within the European framework in the OSCE or in the global framework within the United Nations. And we did a lot with the Russians together in the 90s and even in the past decade or so. And that's come to a halt. It is now clear, and it has been clear to some of us for quite a while, but it certainly is clear since early 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, that Russia is not interested in integrating with us in the West. And so the challenge for policymakers and the challenge for the next administration, and the challenge for this administration, is so what's the new policy? We know what the old policy prior to the integration policy was, which is a Cold War confrontation. And the differences between the Soviet Union and then and Russia today are significant. They're significant in terms of capabilities. They're talking about a country that has an economic size of Spain. This is not the same as the Soviet Union was. A military that, though modernizing, is not anything like the Soviet military, except for it retains nuclear weapons. And although it has an ideology, a very nationalist ideology, it's not an ideology that appeals to anybody else. So it's not about exporting ideology. So the idea of going back to a Cold War system doesn't quite work. Instead, I think we need to examine Russia for what it is. It's a power that likes to be a great power, and our goal should be to try to resist that great power impulse, where it is important for us to resist. Whether that's Syria or not is a debate we can have. It certainly is in Europe. The public opinion shows that, in fact, there is a very strong basis for doing so by recommitting ourselves to NATO in all of its manners, and I think we could probably do more to push on the side. I think economically, given that it's a country the size of Spain, sanctions, and now the Germans are starting to talk about sanctioning Russia over its behavior in Syria. Sanctions are something that we can unify around, and it is important to unify. That's the old Cold War strategy, maintaining unity of the West, in order to push them. Strengthening defenses, which is also happening. Europeans, despite what, and I know that Donald Trump would, I'm sure, take credit for this, but Europeans are actually starting to increase defense spending, and that's a good thing. We've been trying to say that for about 60 years, and it's good when it happens. And those are all parts and parcel of the strategy. I don't think you want to go back to the Cold War. I don't think that this is a division of us versus them. It is really Russia versus the rest, and we need to get everybody to be part of that strategy.
Jane, I know you've got a lot to say about this, but I just want to prompt you in one way, which is you have a lot of background in intelligence, and I'm just wondering, is there any precedent for what's being reported that the Russians seem to be trying to do in interfering in this election campaign? Have they ever been this audacious before in trying to meddle in U.S. politics?
I don't think in this way. And again, I only know the reporting. I haven't been briefed on this, and if I were briefed, I wouldn't tell you what I was briefed on. But I think it's quite clear that they, or whatever, Guccifer and these hackers, non-state actors possibly coordinating with them, are trying to make mischief. And no, sure, we've all, people spy on each other. I know we're all shocked. But this level of attempted manipulation, I don't think has been seen, and I don't think we have done it elsewhere, again, according to public reporting, anywhere, ever. But what I worry about is that cyber hygiene in political organizations is pretty poor. The DNC, according to reports, knew for months that there were hacks and didn't fix the problem. And let's assume that's one of the more sophisticated political organizations, the RNC the same way. But you go down the food chain and you talk about state and local political organizations. The states regulate the manner and the timing and manner of elections according to our Constitution. So this is not a national activity to a great extent. So we can see it is possible that computerized voting machines without paper backup, and 5 states have them, could possibly be tampered with. The Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, said, it was reported in the paper today, that 50% of the states have asked for some help from the Homeland Department. That's good, but that's only 50%. What about the other 50%? One of the states, I think, without the paper backup that has computerized voting is Pennsylvania, which easily could be a battleground state. And what if, think the worst case, what if credible questions are raised after the election, the count is very close, about whether Pennsylvania's machines were manipulated by a foreign power. This is even worse than the hanging Chad issue we faced some time ago, I think, because at least we could look at ballots. Here, we wouldn't be able to look at ballots, and the software may be messed up. So it's a great question. And the only other thing I'd say about Russia is that the laws of economics don't seem to apply. The sanctions have been devastating on Russia's economy. It's a failing state economically, and yet Putin becomes more and more aggressive. You may say that that's why he's more and more aggressive. I don't know how to assess that. But I think he's filling a vacuum that shouldn't be there. And I'm not saying we should all of a sudden insert the U.S. military in eastern Ukraine and get into a war with Russian troops, but I'm saying we need to find ways to parry his thrusts more effectively than we are finding.
Well, I'd like to open it up to questions. Other people, and so just raise your hand, and we have someone with a microphone, so just I only ask just identify yourself before you ask your question. Yes, sir.
TJ Radke, loyal reader of the Washington Post. My question, I would put at the top of threats Twitter. And by Twitter, I mean kind of the age of Twitter thought, lack of critical thinking, education, and whatnot. And to Corey's point about the president or leaders needing to do a better job of educating people about these issues, how do you do it in this era of ADHD for all practical purposes?
So I'm prepared to defend Twitter, actually, because
Yeah, we're great Twitter audience.
I use Twitter as a curated newsfeed, right? I follow terrific journalists who are in Syria, who have important opinions on subjects that I care about. So Twitter isn't of necessity, foolish people ranting. You have choice about who you listen to and what voices you bring in. And so I would encourage everybody to engage a broad diversity of views on Twitter so that you open yourself up to other opinions. Since it's only 140 characters, you're not making a huge investment. That said, there are lots of people who get important messages across on Twitter. I think John McCain's reasonably good on Twitter, for example. So even politicians can master this. Even old politicians can master this. They just need to do so.
But I do think there is a risk of people on Twitter. You can choose your own information. You can choose who you follow, and then you probably choose, most people aren't as enlightened as you, and will choose those outlets that reinforce your existing views. So there is a...
Corey reads the articles, not just the headlines.
Exactly, she's a superwoman.
Yes, in the first row.
So thank you very much. My name is Guillermo Fernandez, and I come from the Embassy of Spain. So my question is for Mr. Daller. Mr. Daller, first of all, I don't know if your comment about Russian economy was a good comment for Spain or a bad comment.
It's a good comment. Take it as
or a bad comment for Russia. So my question is, so I think you made a really good point about that maybe it's not about the consensus that NATO, for example, or TTP must get in the US, but the consensus and the support that must gain in Europe. And related with this, for example, with the NATO, recently there was a summit in Bratislava, and where French and German officials, they were talking about a future European armed forces, a future European way of defense. My question, two questions about this, very small. Like first, do you think the US would perceive this in a good way? And second of all, do you think it has like a future to develop this idea and to grow up this idea?
So this is the question of whether the Europeans should build up their European defense cooperation, possibly even getting a European army that the French and the Germans have been pushing post-Brexit. I think this has less to do with defense and armies and capabilities and more to do with politics internal to the European Union in a post-Brexit environment. There's an attempt to find another way in which Europe can cooperate, and France and Britain, France and Germany have looked at this particular issue as one way to do that. They used to do it with the Poles, by the way. They forgot to bring them in this particular case. I think the U.S. view should be very relaxed about this. I think what we care about is strong European defense capability. And if stronger European cooperation leads to better defense capability, I'm all for it. I have my doubts. I spent most of my life looking at European security questions, so I have serious doubts that this is what's going to do that. But our policy should not be this is a bad idea. Our policy is show me the money. That is, show me what is coming, where is the capability coming from. And I think Britain, which has traditionally been the key to be against European defense cooperation, not being there makes it possible, it seems to me, to do more in Brussels on defense cooperation, and we should be relaxed about it. It should be a good thing for Europeans who want to cooperate on defense. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for NATO, but it needs to lead to more capability, more spending, and more capability in the end, rather than just a bunch of talking heads, because we have plenty of talking heads in Brussels. That's not the problem. The problem is we don't have enough military capability when it comes to defending their countries.
I see Mac Dessler. in the-
All the way in the back.
Yeah,
Matt.
yes.
The great Mac Dessler.
Thank you, Ivo. The discussion of Russia reminds me of what I believe was previously a common feature of Chicago Council polls, which was temperature readings of American attitudes toward different countries. Russia didn't ever get too high or great than this, but it varied. And I wonder if that's something you decided not to do on a permanent basis. I don't believe it's in here, at least I couldn't see it in here. Whether there's something you might do every few years, whether you did it maybe, but it wasn't part of the report. I'm just curious because that was an interesting indicator that I think was unique to the Chicago Council in its public opinion surveys.
So the answer to that is yes, we did it. And the data is available or is shortly available on our website. The big change we have done, so the council poll used to be every 4 years, and then it would be every 2 years. We're now doing it every year. And as a result, because we're doing it every year, we can actually ask more questions because we don't ask every question every year. And over time, we will have a much larger database on questions that we have that we can use. So we did it this year. I think we did it last year. Next year, it will be for sure be in the report on the temperatures. I know the temperature is the thermometer of where you stand in American feelings is particularly hot for embassies and countries around the world because they want to know whether they are going up or down, and when India goes up or down, that is big news. When the Canadians go up and down, it's really big news on that. So, and by the way, Canada is, just so you know, they are on top. We like Canadians better than anybody else. It's an 81 right now. Temperature from 0 to 100 is an 81, and we don't like the Iranians, which is shocking. The North Koreans, which is shocking, and on Russia we're at 40 right now. So that's not a great point to be at.
But Matt, we can give you those results at
Yes,
the end of this
The
session.
woman here on the aisle.
My name is Liliana Rodriguez. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina, national defense expert and besides NDU former student. My question is for Ms. Dinas. I have observed, pay attention to all the graphics you present, and I have a question concerning those statistics. Which is the percentage of young people who supports Trump, and on which basis? And because in general, young people or the youth is the mirror of the future policies.
Right. Young people, so Donald Trump supporters in general tend to be more white than other Republican candidate supporters and the general public overall. They tend to be a bit less educated than other Republican supporters. But the interesting thing is that they're often considered working class, lower income individuals as well, but they are actually not. They are their income levels are the same as average Americans. So on the youth, Donald Trump doesn't have he is least popular among the youth. So this is on page 9 of the report. 30% of Donald Trump core supporters are 60 plus, and then 54% are between the ages of 30 and 59, and only 16% are between 18 and 29. And in general, Bernie Sanders got more young supporters than any of the other candidates.
I would just add that in the Brexit vote, as I remember, millennials, or the equivalent, wanted to stay.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
a group that was overwhelmingly on the stay side, the Remain side, and it was older voters who wanted to leave.
Yes, and that's similar to our.
And in the Chicago Council survey, the attitudes favoring trade, favoring an America engaged in the world, favoring strong alliance relationships, favoring international institutions, favoring international agreements,
Globalization.
that the younger respondents in the poll were even more positive about those things than older respondents were. So if you are looking for a trajectory, as the report says, the trajectory grows more positive on all of those things as American voters age.
Of course, younger people are also less threatened. They feel less threatened, and as people get older, more and more they sense threat perception. So some of it could be a life cycle, but we'll see.
One of the interesting facts in the point, just to conclude that, that I saw was that it says that the millennials as a generation are about to replace the baby boomers as the biggest voting group in the United States.
Yeah.
Yes, in the center, please. Yes.
Bo Miller, I was formerly State Department INR, now at the National Intelligence University. My question has to do with the level of confidence you have in the honesty of your survey respondents on some of that positive information about Trump court supporters on things like trade and TTIP. We know from a little experience watching the French polls on the National Front twice that people know what's politically correct, and sometimes they don't actually level with you, but when they get in the voting booth, it comes out a little differently. I'd like to get some comment on that.
Yeah, I can comment on that. Hi, Bo. So our survey is not designed to predict the elections. We really just wanted to be able to split out the electorate so that we could make sense of the political moment and how we got here. And so, so we weren't too concerned about capturing the exact percentage of a core Trump supporter. This was also back in June, so that we didn't even have finished the primaries at that point. But I will say that some of the online polls have had better success in capturing people who feel uncomfortable, perhaps, in saying they will support Donald Trump than a telephone survey where there's actually a person on the other end who the respondent may feel judged or feel that they have to give one response versus another because of some socially acceptable response. So I do feel online polls are a better measure for that, or a better strategy for that. But at the same time, you saw those opinions of Middle East immigrants and Mexican immigrants, and it didn't seem like people were holding back and expressing their unfavorable opinions.
God forbid if they did,
Yeah, but they have to vote. And there's been a low incidence of voting among certainly Latino immigrants over time. I just wanted to add one thing to that. And I'm not sure it's honesty or dishonesty, but voting is a very emotional exercise, and an answer to a poll may be a more rational exercise. And the newspapers are full today about Trump's strategy in getting out the early vote, and that is to hold rallies and get everyone spun up, and then they go vote early in the states where they can. And Hillary Clinton's strategy is more laid back and focused and more rational. And I don't know whether that works. She also doesn't have the money that she has to put anything else in place. But if voters are motivated in an emotional way, they still may have views that to most of us sound like the views we have, but they still may vote for a candidate who gets them riled up emotionally.
Yeah. That was really, for me, one of the most surprising things in this study was how Republican voters who profess those positive views are in very large numbers voting for a candidate who doesn't reflect them.
It's in the center. Is that you, Howard?
Yes. Hi, thanks. Howard LaFranchi, Christian Science Monitor. I'd like to know what the survey says about evolving American opinion on use of military force to back up diplomatic goals or our national security goals, and specifically if that might give us any clues as to how the next president might act towards Syria, for example.
So this year, we asked about the effectiveness in various measures in combating terrorism. And this year and last year, as ISIS came to dominate the news more and more, and as these attacks happened over the past year, there has been some increasing support for limited military action, but we didn't ask specifically this year about supporting sending troops. It's not in this report, but we have another survey on terrorism and one on Syria that has it. But in general, Americans support the current strategy of bombing from the air, and they think that sending special ops forces to train are effective, but they tend to have less support for sending in ground troops. So they support some limited action, but it depends. We have some questions on terrorism and some on Syria. And on Syria, they support a no-fly zone, creating a no-fly zone by just a really narrow majority.
So I think we've been asking these questions for a long time. Last year's report was more focused on this. I think the change isn't large. The general view of the American public is they like military force if the risks to Americans are small.
Yeah.
It's basically, there's where the trade-off is. So they don't, large numbers of combat troops are generally not viewed as a good thing. Airstrikes, particularly precision airstrikes, are get more support. So there's a direct correlation between the risk of the military action and
the perceived threat.
And the
So
perceived
we
threat.
asked these kinds of questions in the surveys that we did for the Project on Civil-Military Relations at Stanford. And public attitudes are largely uninformed on these issues, and therefore very much subject to political leadership. And that especially on Syria, President Obama has made the argument that he's boxed in by public opposition to doing anything, and that's actually not borne out by the data. What the data, the survey data shows is that Americans are actually pretty willing in many instances to use military force. Their reaction is quite sensitive to two things. First, has the president made a case that we need to do this? And second, does what the president is proposing seem to correlate with the importance of doing it? And so, for example, on Syria, you got a lot of negative public feedback because the president had been saying for so long that we shouldn't be involved in Syria. And the plan, the pinprick strikes, in no way seemed to align with the importance that the president was then arguing it needed. So again, it goes back to you need to have a continued conversation with the American public if you expect them to be able to be willing to support those kinds of
There is a way to have that conversation that isn't really being used. After 9/11, the president came to Congress and asked Congress to authorize the use of military force
Excellent
against
point.
the people who had hit us in Afghanistan. That AUMF passed by overwhelmingly. There was one negative vote in the House and the Senate. Everyone else voted for it, certainly including me. That is the old, tired thing that is used by the White House to justify ongoing military action in the Middle East. It was to apply, no one who voted for it, certainly among them I, thought it would still apply 15 years later to actions that don't directly involve people who hit us on 9/11. You could make some chaining argument that these are people who related and knew about and also were terrorists, but hey, Congress could take up a new AUMF. Obama sent one up, which was dead on arrival, and there has been no conversation about changing it and taking it up. I would just suggest that one of the reasons for that is Congress doesn't want to own the problem. Let the White House own it. And the cynicism there is kind of depressing. Members of Congress have been here, and both parties calling that irresponsible. But we could have that conversation in the next administration, and the next president could ask for an AUMF if she wants it.
And it merits saying that Tim Kaine has been a major force for getting a new authorization.
He was one of the people who said that here, that it was irresponsible for Congress not to do this.
You know, one of the interesting things about the vice presidential debate was that both candidates said they supported a no-fly zone in Syria, which must mean that at least they think there's support out there for it somewhere. But I think the question it leads to is that, is there some prospect, do you think that there will be some change of direction in Syria policy by the next president? Jane, what do you think?
Well, I hope so. We just had this conversation offline before the panel. I do understand the risks, and one could argue this isn't our fight, but I think that the fact that 250,000 people are cowering in their basements with no food and water in eastern Aleppo, and 100,000 of them are kids, is so horrifying that in some ways it is our fight. And if Syria disintegrates, not only will there be this huge mass casualties, but an increase, I think, in the terror threat, which does impact us. So I think we need a more aggressive strategy. We've created a vacuum which Russia has filled. My own view was we should have done the limited surgical strike some years back and taken out their airfields and their air assets while we did it. And that would have prevented a big part of the problem. The options are more difficult now, but I think we have to try everything that is sensible, short of a land war. I'm not for that, and I don't think there's support for that, to try to turn this around.
Ivo, you have thoughts?
So I think on both sides, no matter who's president, there's going to be they're both leaning forward on this issue. Donald Trump has said a lot of different things, but he's also said that he wants to engage more forcefully, and certainly Secretary Clinton did so when she was Secretary of State and has made that part of her campaign. So I think the temptation coming in is to say we got to do something. But this reminds me very much of 1992, 1993, when we had an incoming administration, in fact both sides, and at least the challenger, Bill Clinton, saying we needed to do something in Bosnia, and came in and started sitting down and saying we got to go do something, and then they looked at what they could do, and it turned out that, one, the military, which has not been particularly supportive of doing more in Syria, came out and said there are a couple of things that you will, there's some decisions you will have to make in terms of what you're willing to do, but these options aren't as easy as they may have sounded on the campaign trail. And so I think you're going to have a quite significant debate internally with the intelligence community and the military community. There's a new team coming in, although if it's a Clinton team, they're not that new. They've been part of these debates for a very long time. The president, who is a key actor on Syria in this administration, will of course be a key actor on Syria in the next administration. But my sense would be, if I have to bet, that we will see more change in rhetoric than we will see in terms of fundamental change in the course of our engagement. Because the reality is that there isn't a hell of a lot we can do without fundamentally committing to the fight. And I'm not sure anybody is willing to commit to the fight. And that's going to be the same debate we had in 92 and 93 and 94 and 95 in Bosnia, when things changed on the ground that enabled us to intervene. And I think that's the debate. This debate, frankly, we're not having, but that's a debate that's going to happen inside the administration.
So I agree with Ivo that neither Donald Trump nor Hillary Clinton is likely to do much more on Syria, that we are likely to see perhaps a change in rhetoric, but not a change in policy. And I think that's terrible for our country. I think we have a lot of interests, strategic, regional, and humanitarian, for doing a lot more than we're doing. But I fear we are giving Hillary Clinton too much credit for hawkish rhetoric that will not be followed up by policy. And some of the things she has been saying about Syria, like ruling out ground troops, portend ill for a sensible policy that helps protect Syrians, that raises the cost to the Assad regime and to the Russians for the war crimes they are committing in Syria right now, that takes the pressure off of Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and countries in the region who have done enormously good work in taking in a tidal wave of refugees. There's so much we could do that we're not doing, and it's not true that public opposition is set in stone. The public is persuadable on these things. We're just not doing the persuading.
Yeah, there's a give and take between what a policymaker puts forth, the constraint that public opinion initially puts on a policymaker, but then they shift as they go back and forth and negotiate.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Yes, sir.
I'm Ian Smith with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I'm not representing them today, but my question is on the topic of American thinking on traditional alliances. We've seen that among the overall public, 89% support the existing alliances. Then when asked about NATO specifically, we're seeing keep the commitment at 63%. Some say increase, some say decrease. To Dina, how does this line up with historical numbers of NATO and other like institutions? Mm-hmm. And then to anyone, how do the current levels of support line up are seen in light of current military actions? In other words, is this some vague feeling that we ought to continue supporting these alliances, we don't want a major war with Russia? Or is there any connection to if we had armed the Ukrainians, or if we had done this or that, put a brigade combat team there, or if we had put in more political capital into taking our decisions on security within the institutions, that somehow things would be different today than they are?
So I'll just quickly say the percentages on NATO and maintaining or increasing our commitment to NATO are on maintaining and increasing, it's a little bit higher. It's about stable on the other ones, but it's really kind of a latent appreciation for alliances. I don't think Americans know the specifics of what the agreements are. In fact, they're on our list of goals, what foreign policy goals should be. Defending our allies' security is 35% very important, which is not super high on their list. But in general, they sort of outsource the strategies to other people who are foreign policy experts because not everybody can follow all the foreign policy issues on their own. So they have a general goodwill toward the alliances. They think it's the most effective way to advance our foreign policy goals. But then when we ask about some of the specifics, like defending our allies, it seems to be lower on their list.
Just if I make a final sort of put it all together, I mean, I think the numbers on alliances, on traditional engagement, demonstrate that you can have a foreign policy of active American leadership and engagement in the world, and that there's no constraint on public opinion. That doesn't mean that you can't drive public opinion one way or the other. We asked, for example, whether you support extending the wall on the Mexican border. And 92% of core Trump supporters think that's a good idea. I don't think that 92% of those people even thought about that before the campaign. So you can drive public opinion. By the way, it's 50-50 when it comes to overall U.S. Thinking on this. So leadership is part of what you do when you have public opinion. I think what this report demonstrates is the idea, which you kind of find in the way that people are talking about it, that Americans are becoming increasingly isolationist, increasingly anti-immigrant, increasingly anti-trade, increasingly anti-globalization. It's just not the case. There is a constituency in the United States that believes like that. Donald Trump has been extraordinarily effective in mobilizing that constituency, so much so that he's now close. He's one of the two candidates to win the White House. It's a big deal. But the larger point is actually the United States is pro-trade, pro-immigration, pro-alliances, the kind of foreign policy that this country has been pursuing for the last 70 years, and that those of us who care about being part of an open international system should find gratifying that the basis for that kind of policy exists.
But to make that make those views mean something. One, people have to vote in this election, but two, after the election, whoever wins, the Congress has to work too. And a lot of the voices in Congress, the center is not reflected in Congress anymore. And the edges in Congress are anti-trade, not anti-immigration. That's an uneven thing. But they're not necessarily in favor of enforcing the old liberal order that I think most of us think needs perhaps some tweaking. Certainly it does, but is the best way to carry American values and interests forward. So the next president, I would hope, would make some effort to make Congress work again and to work with Congress on a way to bring the public into a debate and to lead the country and to, it just seems to me, to fill some vacuums that have been created and that are giving advantage to other countries like Russia, which to me is a very bad development.
Well, with that, we're out of time. Thank you to the audience for really smart questions. And thank you to our panelists.